Hello, I'm Simon Palfrey. I'm one of the editors of Beyond Criticism, which is a new series of critical and creative works coming from Boiler House Press. And this is the second in a series of launches of the four books which mark the start of this exciting new series. We're looking to make criticism new, to make literary criticism more creative, to find new ways of doing what we do. Last week, we introduced Macbeth, and this week, for our second event, it's going to be the launch of Ansgar Allen's quite astonishing novel called The Sick List. And we're going to have a terrifically various event today featuring various responses to Ansgar's work. But we're going to begin with Ansgar himself, talking about what he's done and why he's done it. And I hope you all enjoy it. Over to you, Ansgar. We'll be starting with a film.
Gordon's life was a disaster beyond the grasp of any biographer. Only one thing about Gordon interested me: how the disaster of Gordon's life was reflected in Gordon's thought, and how the disaster of Gordon's thought was reflected in his life. As thinkers, we are entirely overrated. We occupy most of the time we spend thinking, or attempting to think, overrating ourselves as thinking beings. Most thought is an attempt to exaggerate the extent to which we can think at all. 3 weeks after Gordon's co-worker was found dehydrated and still, 2 more co-workers were discovered in a similar condition. They were both sitting in their respective offices. One had not been seen since Monday and was discovered on Thursday, sitting on his swivel chair facing the computer. Gordon lingered on and prolonged the will to dismissal in those he encountered so that it became unbearable. Assimilate or dismiss, Gordon made both impossible. It was his art, and his alone so far as I knew. It was the art of unbearable ambiguity. The university was setting up its own psychiatric ward to care for employees on site. This became the typical response of the university sector. Universities were everywhere setting up psychiatric wards, I discovered. My own institution was particularly proud of its own. Not only was it the first to set up such a ward, it could also boast the most impressive ratio between diminished employees and beds. We had more beds than we needed, and so were always ready, whereas other institutions often had more immobile and desiccated employees than beds. Gordon was sick, but he was also a sickness. Gordon was the manifestation of a sickness from which a sickness of his own, the sickness of Gordon, would spread. The more I knew Gordon, the more I became sick with Gordon. Our doctors became our educators. Our educators became our researchers, and our researchers became our doctors. They will not tell us that we are dying. They will not even allow us to tell ourselves that we are dying. At its best, which is when education is at its worst, educators know their patients so well that they understand exactly, Gordon underlined, in which of its limbs and body parts the world is weakest. These weakest parts, being our most tender parts, are manipulated with the greatest care. It is towards the weakest limbs that our best educators are most gentle, I heard Gordon say, as he underlined that text.
The sick list takes the form of a single paragraph in which the narrator, an unnamed academic in an unnamed contemporary university, relates his obsession with his tutor, Gordon. The narrator gets to know Gordon through the books that Gordon reads, books he gets hold of and subsequently studies. These books contain annotations made by Gordon, and those annotations are used as clues to Gordon's thought. He becomes convinced that Gordon wishes to teach him something by the annotations Gordon makes and leaves in the books he reads. But he is never entirely sure just what the lesson is and what it means for him to learn it. This reading of Gordon's books produces a kind of derangement, a form of sickness. This sickness takes hold in the mind of the narrator, who wishes to learn more about Gordon by reading Gordon's books. The narrator's derangement plays out alongside a broader sickness which begins to afflict the academy. And here the novel describes an epidemic of sorts. The sick list was written long before the current pandemic. And the sickness it describes is not specifically medical. It is a form of cultural sickness, a cultural sickness that is also an institutional sickness. This sickness is a sickness that is built into academic life and educated culture. Traces of it can be found in the books that Gordon has the narrator read, but the sickness also travels beyond them. It is not clear if Gordon is the agent of that broader sickness or merely its messenger. So that was the book in its outline. Now I would like to briefly discuss how the novel, both a work of fiction and a work of criticism, relates to my other activities as an author and as a university employee. This, I hope, will help contextualize the book a little further. The Sick List was written in late 2017, during a period of intense reading in which I was working through a long list of books, mainly fiction, including those books cited in the novel. The novel presents a reading of those books as they are quoted, discussed, and footnoted. This reading of books is also a misreading of them, as the books involved are taken apart for the messages that are written into them. Writing the Sick List helped me to read these books. It allowed me to put the books to work within my thought in ways that more conventional forms of academic reading and academic writing disallow. The novel is also written in relation to what I had written before. It continues that work, but it breaks with it too. In terms of continuity, the Sick List allowed me to further develop ideas and expand upon previous arguments concerning education, educational relationships, the violence of educational institutions, and so on. The Sick List is also a consequence of my continued interest in academic form and its limits. It represents another experiment in working within and against those limits and exploring the different thoughts that different forms of writing permit. In terms of where the novel breaks with my previous writing, the novel allowed me to take ideas that I already had and carry them forward in directions I would never attempt otherwise. In other contexts, in my previous writing, I would not develop ideas as I did in the Sick List because of the constraints of other kinds of writing. These are the constraints of more earnest forms of writing, writing that takes a position and wants to make a point and stick by that point and win the argument. I'm referring here to those contexts of authorship where the author is identified, rightly or wrongly, with the argument they present. This is very much the context of academia. In a fictive context, it was possible to let ideas play out more freely, exhaust and contradict themselves without the need to stand before them, to stand for what I write, and be prepared to defend claims against counterclaims and submit thereby to the endless logic and ego work of academic debate. So, the sick list presents points of view I hold, points of view I no longer hold, and distortions of those points of view, as well as ideas I would never stand for or stand by, but have found interesting to work with and inhabit. Working with ideas in the context of a novel offered me a set of permissions that scholarship denies. It allowed thought to travel in directions it would never otherwise risk. Literature and fiction also impose their own rules of engagement and rigor, of course. But the forms of writing and forms of thought allowed for literature and permitted in fiction is far more diverse than academic inquiry. Switching to fiction opens up an enormous range, a huge number of different registers and approaches that academia, for all its so-called commitment to freedom, will never know, unless it explodes its confines and becomes something completely different to what it is. As a work of fiction, The Sick List presents to itself a version of the university that it subsequently destroys. The university environment that the narrator encounters within the book is a place of deception and self-delusion. It has its employees perform as actors in the work of dissimulation, the first achievement of which is the persistent idea, the lumbering notion, that something we might call the university still exists and once existed. This continued belief in the existence of the university is maintained in spite of, or perhaps because of the fact, that the university presents itself within the book to those who work there as an institution that is suffering from endless turmoil, threats to its existence, and inner decay. The university is a place of crisis, yet the university never fails to exist despite these threats. It inhabits its crisis and has its employees inhabit that crisis too, in a variety of ways and mostly to their detriment. As Gordon might say, this idea of a university, however that claim is inhabited, serves, like the idea of education, to hold together the various activities that comprise it, many of which would not be tolerated if they were not crowded together within the confines of its distended skin. The University of the Sick List is then a place of institutional and conceptual confinement. As such, the novel must fail to describe its object. What this novel depicts, the university, its social order, is grotesque beyond perversion, as Gordon might say, and will always exceed its imaginary. The Sick List is a book succumbing to its image, never managing to depict anything like the magnitude of the inertia of this system, this stifling atmosphere which it narrates. It depicts and fails to depict this institutional achievement, which includes the idea of a university and the collected practices of the university, an achievement, a fact of endurance that must be admired for how it persists, avoiding its own final decay, the accomplishment of its end, even as it continues to assemble the forces of that decay and deploy them against one another. Those who think they are on the point of escaping the university, their confinement, are the most distended beings, warped at the outer limit. The university still conditions their outlook. The words of critique, criticism levelled at the place of work are always stripped back, rendered plain, turned abstract, when delivered from this intermediate space, an employee's confines, the confines of work, workplace permissions, workplace falsehoods, and workplace fears. But worst of all, and most of all, workplace outlooks, where nothing that is said can ever be put as it must be put, or expressed as it must be expressed. By contrast, those who inhabit the space by making themselves amenable, those whose compliance may at times carry with it the ruthlessness of their institution, tend to move more freely and live more easily. These institutional conformists and institutional enablers operate in a manner that critics would come to admire, if those critics did not still suffer the values that they are deceived by and deceive with. The sick list is itself a warped and distended project, sick with itself, obsessed with its own sickness, driven by its turmoil into an extended decay and dismemberment of ideals and beliefs that nevertheless hold and continue to allow the text to exist as a recognizable object within the confines of its writing and the landscape it depicts. Print and artifice exhausted, the sick list enters into its final decay, a premature death or void, a descent into its hollow, the damp earth, leaf mold, the roots of decaying trees. That concludes what I would like to say about the book. It is now my pleasure to introduce Daniela, Cascella, and Emile Boyerson, who will respond to the sick list by bringing the book into creative dialogue with their own work. Both Daniela and Emile are extraordinary thinkers whose work extends well beyond the limits of academic discourse. I'm grateful to them both for their generosity in taking the time to formulate their responses and for their attention to the book, not simply the content, but the form of it too. Daniela is the author of several books, including most recently Singed, published by Equus Press. More recently still, Daniela has been working on the idea of chimeric writing and has a book forthcoming with Punctum Books on that very topic, entitled Nothing as We Need It. In this book, Daniela reshapes the activity of study and critique by exploring new modes of address and thought, monstrous forms of writing, impure forms that are enacted and studied in her work. Of course, Daniela's work resists summary. Her work is to be experienced, and I could not recommend it more highly. The same goes for the work of Emile Boyerson, whose recent book, Forms of Education, published by Routledge and now out in paperback, offers an extraordinary analysis of education, taking the idea of education well beyond its current conceptual and institutional limits. Emile has also been working with sound as part of his research, as a means, and I quote, of illustrating, supporting, expanding, undermining, and exceeding the limits of academic philosophical argument, end quote. Emile performs electronic music under the name Fex, as well as under his own name. Like Daniela's work, Emile's work and creative output has that rare attribute of deserving repeated, careful reading as well as listening. Again, I could not recommend his work more highly. Emile also has a special place in the writing of the sick list. We spoke at length about the book as it was written, about the books it incorporated, and about the figure of Gordon in particular, as Gordon took form in the book. I look forward to hearing what they make of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ansgar. I am going to read a text that I assembled in response to the sick list in the form of a remix, a sick remix. As many of you will know, a remix implies sampling, implies modification, implies exaggeration, in times implies rarefied moments. I think I will briefly go through the elements from the sick list that I decided to sample, and by sampling I'm trying to look at possibility for quotation. On a very immediate level, there are sentences from the book which resonated with my own concerns, and those of you who already have had the chance to read the text will probably recognize some of them. Toward the end of my piece, I needed a list of adverbs, and all these adverbs come from Ansgar's book, which I read from the last page backwards, sampling all the adverbs until I could no longer sustain the exercise. I was also interested in sampling in terms of rhythms and structures, syntactical structures. So there's quite a good amount of that in my piece. Then there's what I would call somatic sampling, atmospheric sampling. How do we quote an atmosphere? How could I sample the sense of obsession in the book, the stifling atmosphere, but also the sinister irreverence that we read in these pages and we perceive somatically while reading. And finally, an element that struck me visually in the book, footnotes. I work quite a lot with the use of footnotes, and specifically there's something that happens on page 54 and 55, and I hope that you can see this curtain of footnotes here. Yeah, that kind of called me. So the sick remix is written in the voice of somebody inside of the psychiatric ward that Ansgar introduces in the book. So it's a writing of derangement. It's a voice of somebody who's possessed by many voices. It's a writing also of disturbance and interference and completely unhinged syntax. And for this purpose, I also decided to allow other books to interfere and disrupt the prose. Primarily, I had Henri Michaud's Plume in mind because of its darkly and comic, unsettling tone, and Gertrude Stein's How to Write, whose rhythm I needed in my work of remixes. I needed to address certain points where the prose critically unhinges any expectations of flawlessness or coherence. I needed a sick syntax. So the remix, which I'm going to read now, is in 3 parts. They have titles. I was singing in my head the idea of no rhyme, no reason, trying to unsettle any reason in rhyme. And the 3 titles are The Thick Mist, The Sick Fist, and The Six Twists. A sick mix in 3 parts. This might be entitled The Thick Mist. It would start with neo-Gothic epigram, overthrow any expectation of logic or inner taste for clarity. It would start with a neo-Gothic epigram entitled The Thick Mist, to set a tone, solemn and serious, an epigram such as, may the disaster speak in me, blaze words unreasoned, utter but one tone, surrounded by the thick mist, sick list in my head, a dirge in monotone. It might then begin to move in asynchronous degrees of repetition and degrading repetition of degraded reputation, and provoke the only laughter we may be capable of, the convulsive laughter full of dread. What a nuisance, the utilitarian politeness, the futile cover of hyperactivity. Unable to see the underlined void we underlined, you quoted, we repeat, degrading to the utmost degree, thinking how much we have to do and would be doing, the feeling of how much there is to do, how little time, Our heads full of things to do and no time to do them, things to write, no time to write them, and it cannot be compared, no, cannot be voiced, while not having the faintest idea where the thing is we want to write. Somewhere, elsewhere, and there is no time, is all there is to say. Better perhaps to forget, but we don't forget, because it is impossible to let go. It does not stop of its own accord, no matter what, insufferable, impossible to hold, can only blather nonsense, for there is a domain of nothingness, dreadful weight, pressing, devouring, closing upon itself. The politeness beside the bother, the insufferable neatness, the attended violent ability, the avoided alarm, the pitiable state of hyperactivity that we call research, of which it is not a pleasure that we are speaking here, we underlined, you quoted, degrade to the utmost degree, degrade in every 76, 78, reading footnotes now. It is the death of thought, all this footnoting, this 59, this 132, 1, 2, yes, you, not, rot, 2, 1 and 2 is 3, for you is nothing. Sick at the thought of it, plagued with the thought of writing when not writing, worry, sigh, how much I have to do, how little time I have to do it. An abstract sense of guilt, and then nothing, the ever so fashionable something referred to as nothing, the so-called absolute nothing, full of unbearable pathos, the undeterminable, malleable nothing of those half philosophers, the topic of lifeless conversations at panel discussions held in sound-dead, poorly lit, windowless rooms, a nothing stretched, bloated to its breaking point, a balloon of nothing, a monograph nothing, a rotten heap of notes nothing, only called nothing because nothing better fits the nothingness whose workings concern nobody but those who work them, and then they write monographs. Avoid them like the plague. Avoid those authorities in the flat fields of boredom, then and their panel discussions, the empty stare, the pressure of having to say something intelligent, to produce content, when the only possible words to be pronounced are terror, or destroy, or disaster. Take 5 panels, wooden, make a box, place all the discussing participants, leading and non-leading, inside, hit them on the head, close the box with a 6th, concluding plenary panel, and rejoice in the muffled sounds of their expiring, of their smothering. From panel discussion to panel concussion. Tired, I am growing tired, part of that grey sickness called Gordon, the heading on the page. It was given a name, made more familiar, at least you can call it something. Never someone here though, never address. But who do I even think Gordon is? The heading on the page, the grey sickness. These might also be entitled The Sick Fist, a Dream. I dreamt of meeting Gordon in the gutter, the trouble he had in him, the ruin. His head was gigantic, like those papier-mâché props in old theaters looking evil and sad, or a broken marionette, its mouth frozen in a madman's rictus, Gordon, and his giant head full of thoughts, climbing a mud slope that would undoubtedly lead him nowhere. It is not a good sign, I thought in my dream, as I stiffened into painful frenetic contractions, not a good sign to have met with a monster head like that. How much thinking could it possibly host? A nasty omen. In the dream, I knew he was sick, him and all those thoughts. With my uncontrolled, sick fist, I punched his great giant head in one fell swoop. He might have been poorly attached. Heads just don't come off like that. Something must have been wrong with the thoughts inside it, all the thinking that must take the form of doing, of doing, of doing. He must have been poorly attached. Do not blame my sick fist. It was just a dream. It was a bad dream. It was nothing. Be quiet now, nothing. Not right now. Later, when nothing is left, I might summon my strength again and strike once more. But until then, I must keep quiet. I should be content I had a name, Gordon. A name that keeps growing, expands into the white of these pages, standing there alone. And there is nothing to come, no explanation, no commentary. A name like a large head. No, that was in the dream, a large heading with nothing underneath, a blank page. And further down below, many, many footnotes. This might also be entitled The Six Twists, Death by Footnotes, a catatonic chant. Dare numeri in Italian means to be deranged, to speak empty words. It also means literally to read out numbers, footnotes in this case, deranged. 23, Bernard Thomas, yes, 59. 24, Bernard Thomas, yes, page 61. 25, Bernard Thomas, yes, page 65. 26, Bernard Thomas, yes, page 74. 27, Bernard Thomas, yes, page 64. 28, Bernard Thomas, yes, page 113. 23, Bernard Thomas, yes, these ugly complainers, 59. 24, Bernard Thomas, yes, psychiatric wards everywhere, 61. 25, Bernard Thomas, yes, I am sickness and my sickness become yours, 65. 26, Bernard Thomas, yes, the workings of dark humor, 74. 27, Bernard Thomas, yes, it is the death of thought, all this footnoting, 64. 28, Bernard Thomas, yes, this footnoting, 113. Thomas, yes, no, terror, or so I heard it whispered, terror. Watch, as meaning turns to vapor, turns to 65. 26, looking sick these days, it is this sickness, yes, it is more or less, or is it most and best, this sickness? No, I'm all right, right, left, right, left. I had a good job, but I left. Many are so sick with thinking of writing, not writing. Many are very sick with thinking of writing, not writing, so much to write so little time. Some keep on believing they are contributing something. Knowledge, right, right, left. Those who are left are very sick. Many think of writing and not contribute anything. Bleach the night, deepen its shadows, plunged into this darkness by these lights, amber lights of borders and transitions, replaced by white lights of reason. It is like this. Many who are sick ones, or while they are being sick, are always experiencing their own conceit of potentially being ones being writing, not writing. Some, while they're being sick ones, are being ones experiencing a great deal of their own conceit of potentially being writing, not writing, too little time. Some, while they're being sick, are experiencing very little of their own conceit of being writing, not writing, little time. Some, while they're being sick, have at times the conviction of being ones being writing. Some are certain that being sick ones makes of them ones writing, and this is indeed quite sickening. How? Let me tell you how sickening. How rapidly and how entirely, how hardly, how directly, how inwardly, how hardly, how likely, how entirely, how dreadfully, how intellectually, how absolutely, how hardly, how thoroughly, how increasingly, how completely, how merely, how entirely, how completely, how hardly, how entirely, how remarkably, how library, anything and everyone is coming out of that one. They're locked, ruined inside the critic clinic. And the way each one is experiencing, the amount each one is thinking of writing, not writing, is a chronic condition about which some have sickness, about which some do not know that they have a sickness, about which some are sick, about which some are hardly writing anything, are not writing.
Eternally perpetuated and suspended collapse of the university.
The last educator.
Ansgar, the sickness, fascinates itself with the eternally perpetuated and suspended collapse of the university. Ansgar, the sickness, fascinates itself with the eternally perpetuated and suspended collapse of the university.
The last educator.
Ansgar, the sickness, fascinates itself with the eternally perpetuated and suspended collapse of the university. Ansgar, the sickness, fascinates itself with the eternally perpetuated and suspended collapse of the university. Ansgar, the sickness, fascinates itself with the eternally
Contemporary university. Proclaim or defend educational ideals.
rather pointing towards the hollowness of their performance in the contemporary university. Proclaim or defend educational ideals, rather pointing towards the hollowness of their performance in the contemporary university. Dissimulation.
As well as the secret fascinating stuff.
Confusion. Darkness. Education cannot be saved, it is terminal. Confusion. Education cannot be saved, it is terminal. Darkness. Education cannot be saved, it is simulation. Education cannot be saved, it is terminal. Confusion. Darkness. Dissimulation. Educational posture. Suspicion. Educational posture. Psychiatric war. Educational posture. Educational posture. The university is obsessed with itself. 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 Education cannot be saved. Education cannot be saved. It is confusion. Education cannot be saved, it is terminal. Education cannot be saved, it is terminal. Education cannot be saved, it is terminal. Education cannot be intellectually stimulated, but ultimately a phantom. We follow in its own way the last guns of the university, intellectually and dispositionally stimulated, but ultimately a phantom. We follow educational postures that exist on a life cycle and psychiatric wards. Educational postures that exist on a life cycle. Educational postures that exist. Educational postures that exist on a life cycle and psychiatric wards. Educational postures that exist. Education cannot be saved, it is terminal. 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 The university is obsessed with itself. The university is obsessed with itself.
Well, thank you. That brings to an end our event, our cyclist event. I'm a bit speechless after that. I mean, I've been terminated. Well, thanks ever so much to Daniela, to Emile, and to Ansgar for that. It was a very provocative and stimulating series of responses, I think, to truly provocative and stimulating work, which is, I have to say, beautifully written and caustic, but also funny. It's a work written in the image of a kind of mordant humor, very much inspired by Thomas Bernhard, the great Austrian misanthrope. Anyway, so that's the end for today. If anybody wants to have a response or write, then Ansgar is very happy for people to write to him at his email address in Sheffield, which is a.allen with an E at sheffield.ac.uk. That's the end, and so I hope you all enjoyed that. And the next one in the Beyond Criticism series is Steve Hanson's quite stunning work, The Shaken Bible, which is a sort of mashup of the scripture with Blake, the Ranters, and sort of northern dissidents, which, like The Cyclist, is a remarkably brave and innovative and thought-provoking piece of writing. So I hope you can join us for that next week. Thank you very much.